Honestly, if you're not breaking out the dark and spooky books at this point in September, then I don't know what to say to you. Hey everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel. This story ain't over. It's September. Spooky season is on the horizon. I don't care if it's not officially fall. I am here to give you over 40 plus book recommendations for this time of the year. I know I'm not alone in loving spooky season and the fall. I know there's a lot of us who rise from the dead on September 1st once summer is over. And although I love the summer and all the sunshine and the beachy vibes, I still really love a cozy fall, curling up with a book and a cup of tea and just getting lost in a story all through the night. So I've done this video a few times before, so you can check out previous year's versions down below. For today's video, I've split up all the book recommendations into different categories, and it's actually pretty surprising how many books I have for each category. I really did not expect it. I'm gonna leave timestamps down below so you can skip to whichever type of spooky book or fall book that you're looking for. But we're gonna start with one of my biggest categories, which is actually vampire books. There are actually so many great vampire books coming out this fall or that have already come out. I've already got a bunch on my Kobo that I'm ready to read ASAP, but as I was trying to compile this list, I started to realize how many vampire books I've actually already read before and that I own. And interestingly enough, a lot of them are actually some favorites of mine. Since I have over 40 plus book recs to give you, I'm gonna keep it pretty high level and short when it comes to describing each of these books. I'll tell you what I feel about it and hopefully you can make an informed decision about whether you want to pick it up. Okay, so first up in the vampire category, I have Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that Silvia Moreno Garcia is one of my favorite authors ever, and she definitely has a way with writing spooky books. Certain Dark Things is a pretty interesting take on vampires in my opinion. It's a neo-noir novel and it's set in an alternate version of Mexico City, and the vampires in the book are actually descended from Aztec blood drinkers, and each sort of faction of these vampires has slightly different abilities. And so in the book we're actually following one main character who is one of these vampires, and she's running from some of the other vampires. This is among one of my favorite Silvia Moreno Garcia books, so it's definitely a great time and definitely has all of the spooky vibes. Now in a more traditional view of vampires, I have A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This one is a fairly popular book on Book Talk, and that's kind of how I ended up picking it up. The book is more of a historical fantasy and it is set in the time of Dracula, and it's a bit of a retelling of Dracula as well. The book is told from the perspective of a character named Constanta, and she is one of Dracula's brides. And the book is written in a really interesting way because we are reading a long letter that Constanta is writing to Dracula. So the book is written in second person and we are addressed as if we are Dracula. The book follows Constanta's relationship with Dracula over many years, and we have other characters who come in. There's a polyamorous relationship, and it overall had this very gothic, sexy, alluring, but also spooky vibe to it that I think is just perfect for this time of year. All right, next up I have House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. This is a really awesome sapphic vampire fantasy, and it basically involves a situation where the main character becomes one of these blood maids for this like high noble woman in the north, and the main character is one of many of these blood maids who serve this noble woman. And in the practice of the northerners and these noble people, they drink the blood to sort of keep themselves young and beautiful. But obviously our main character develops feelings for the noble woman, and that definitely complicates the entire situation. Not only did this have a sapphic romance, it also had some really great female friendships, and personally I just really love that this was sort of a queer take on a really common story, this idea of like the young girl in a defenseless position against the blood drinker, the vampire, and I feel like the dynamic here was just really interesting. Next I have Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas. This is set in 1840s Mexico along the Texas-Mexico border, and although this book has the word vampires in the title, I would say that the vampires are more of a secondary element to the book. The book is more of a second chance romance between these two characters who knew each other when they were much younger, ripped apart for reasons larger than themselves, and end up in a situation where they are alone on the road, where they encounter these monsters that are suspiciously like vampires. I really like the take on vampires in this book because they were kind of seen as creatures, I would say, less as people with a blood drinking penchant. And the setting of this book was just really unique in comparison to a lot of other vampire books I've read. Now, if you're looking for a little bit more of a literary fiction vampire story, then you should definitely check out Woman Eating by Claire Coda. I read this book earlier this year and really enjoyed it. It is a strange book and it's less about the vampires and more about the condition of being a vampire and sort of the hunger that comes with it. Essentially, we follow a main character in our present day whose mother is a vampire, and her mother turned her into a vampire as a baby. And so now she is sort of grown to early 20s, I think, and she has left her mother's side. And she's trying to figure out her life on her own, where to find blood, and how to keep her vampirism hidden. This book is sort of an allegory for like growing up into adulthood and leaving behind a sort of comfortable past. And the vampiric hunger sort of feels like a metaphor for like an eating disorder, I would say, in the way that the main main character craves actual real human food as opposed to only blood, because she finds that food is a way to connect to her heritage and to her family, to her father, who she doesn't know that well, and to the various parts of her background. She is Japanese, Malaysian, and British, I believe, so she's mixed race, and that plays an element into the story and her identity. It's a super short book that you can like fly through in a day, but it's definitely more on the literary side, so keep that in mind. Next, I have one of my favorite vampire books ever, and that is the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. I read this a few years ago and absolutely fell in love with it. Funnily enough, this one doesn't really involve many vampires. It really just talks about one, and that is Dracula. The book is set in the 1990s in the suburbs, and essentially it follows our main character, Patricia Campbell, who is like a housewife. Her entire life revolves around her kids and her husband, and the one thing that keeps her happy is the little book club that she has with the other moms in the town. And so when a mysterious stranger comes to town and everyone's sort of enraptured by him, she happens to be the one who isn't. And she has a sneaking suspicion that he might be responsible for all of the mysterious disappearances at the edge of town. This book is so fantastic in the sense that it tackles the story from a really interesting perspective from the mom character, and it's basically like this story of your mom versus Dracula. Patricia was one of my favorite like main characters I've ever read, and I love the way that this book took the idea of a vampire as a predator and used that in this very real life story. All right, and then my final vampire book is actually a romance, and that is Bride by Ali Hazelwood. As you may know, Ali Hazelwood is the author of many romances, and this is actually her first ever fantasy, and it's written very much in the vein of fanfic surrounding vampires and werewolves, but essentially it follows a marriage of convenience between a vampire and a werewolf, and they're both part of like these very separate factions in this like alternate version of our world where humans know of vampires and werewolves, and they all live in separate areas and try to keep away from each other. And so our main character is Misery Lark, who is this vampire bride, and she's a daughter of like the highest councilman in the vampire society, and she finds herself sort of forced into this marriage of convenience, but finds a very soft and cuddly side to her werewolf husband and to just the werewolves in general and the society that they have. Although this was mainly like a romance, I still really loved like the supernatural elements and just the interesting take on things and how it was really fit into our real world and felt like it could be something real, so that was really enjoyable. All right, next up we're gonna go through the haunted house books that I have, and these ones range from always set in the house to like partly set in the house to the house being a super focus of the book to the house being a semi-focus of the book. So there's a bit of a range here. Some of them are more on the magical side, some of them are more on the horror side, so hopefully you'll find at least one that you're interested in picking up. First up, I have What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This one could also be classified as a gothic horror, I would say, and that's mainly because it's a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, but as the source material's name suggests, it is about this house, the House of the Ushers. The book is set in a fantasy-esque world, and it follows our main character, who is a retired soldier who visits the House of Usher to see their dying friend Madeline, who seems to be affected by the overall darkness of the house and the surrounding grounds. I honestly really liked this one. It was such a short read and also a very spooky one. I definitely was like a little bit scared at certain points, and it was an overall really great time. All right, next I have White is for Witching by Helen Oyeyemi. This is written by a Black author, and it has a bit of a like Get Out-esque tone to it, I would say, and also plotline, I would say. But essentially we follow our main character, Miranda Silver, who suffers from this rare eating disorder called pica, I think. It's where you want to eat like very strange, non-edible things. And this is a condition that's been passed down through the women of her family. Now, most of the plot of the book actually takes place in the haunted house, which is the bed and breakfast that her father runs. The bed and breakfast was built in this old house called the Silver House, and it starts to express this sort of dark and evil aggression towards outsiders. And as you'll learn as you keep reading, the house has a certain type of outsider that it doesn't like. All right, this next book is technically a haunted house story, but it's really more of a fantasy, but I still put it in this category because a lot of the plot and story revolves around this one house. And that book is Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. Again, this is more of a fantasy, but it essentially follows this main character who is obsessed with Starling House in town, especially because it was previously owned by this children's book writer named E. Starling, and whose children's book she read when she was a child and absolutely loved. And so our main character Opal has been obsessed with that children's book, The Underland, for many years. And when she suddenly gets this opportunity to sort of work in Starling House under the new owner, who is a bit of a recluse, she kind of doesn't want to give it up. From there, the story gets more creepy and more weird and more into the fantasy-ish realm. But the book has a bit of a romance to it as well, which manifests in a really interesting way. Overall, I would say that this one's a pretty fun one to read because although it's spooky, it's not very scary. All right, this next one isn't a particular particular favorite of mine, and I think I did DNF it, but the reason I'm recommending it is because I DNF'd it mainly because I wasn't feeling it at the time. But I think if I picked it up again and read it properly, I previously only listened to the audiobook, I think I might have actually enjoyed it because it did start off in a really great way. And that book is The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. This is the same author of Vampires of El Norte, and this one is a bit more of a haunted house story. The book is set in the aftermath of the Mexican War of Independence, and it follows a main character whose home is destroyed when the Mexican government is overthrown and her father is executed. And so she's always sort of dreamed of having her own home again, like a proper one that she can have control of. And so she ends up marrying this very wealthy man and getting that home that she wanted. But it turns out that the house has a lot more secrets than she initially knew of, as does her husband. And as our main character tries to figure out what's going on in the house, she enlists the help of this young priest who she may have a little bit of a thing for. From there, it's got a bit of a romance and also that spooky element to it, and I've heard really great things about it. So even though I didn't particularly love it when I first tried it out, I do know a lot of people who did. All right, next I have probably one of my favorite sort of sub-genres of spooky season, and that is gothic books. And I would like to remind you that a gothic book isn't necessarily meant to be scary. It's meant to be a little creepy and spooky and have an overall commentary on something that the main character is going through. I would say it's more of a vibe than anything else, and it's personally one that I love. And so of course I have to recommend one of my favorite books ever, and that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This one is probably my favorite Silvia Moreno Garcia book, and it is just a really interesting gothic novel where our main character Noemi goes to this like mysterious English manor in the Mexican countryside, which is owned by the husband of her cousin, who has been writing to her and telling her all these strange things that have been happening in the house, and how she thinks her husband is like poisoning her, and how people are walking through walls and all these strange things. So Noemi goes to visit her cousin at this manor house to see if she's okay and see what's going on in the house. Now that I think about it, this could also go into like the haunted house category, but I would say that this book is less about the house itself than it is about the people in the house and the way that the house is run and the way that the cousin's husband's family operates and the injustices that they commit. This book does have a romance that isn't particularly my favorite, but it does add a little bit to the story. And overall, the spooky vibes for this book were just immaculate, and I loved it so much. Okay, next I have This Dark Endeavor by Kenneth Opel. This is a YA that I actually really loved. The book is essentially a retelling of Frankenstein, but is a pretty different take on the story. It essentially follows Victor Frankenstein when he's a teenager, when he's 16. And in this version of the story, Victor actually has a brother, and I think he's actually his twin. And basically in this book, we see Victor go to incredible lengths to protect his brother and also get the girl that he loves, even if that involves some very dark and sinister things. I think the reason I really liked this book was because I loved being in Victor's head and seeing how sort of messed up he was. Like the way that he tries to justify his actions is just so interesting, and it definitely had an overall really spooky vibe. There's some like magical, creepy things going on, and Victor finds himself accessing this like dark library in their manor house. All right, and then the next two gothic books that I have are actually classics, and they are probably some of my favorite books ever. So first I have Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This book, along with the next book I'm going to talk about, are both on the romantic-ish side. If you've never read Wuthering Heights, let me tell you, it is a ride. It is a dense book, even though it's very short, and it's set in the Yorkshire moors, and it has this overall gothic, creepy vibe to it, but it follows this like sort of tragic love story between Kathy and Heathcliff, and part of the issue is their difference in class and the way that she treats him when they are younger, and how he comes back many years later to sort of get her but also take revenge. And it's just such an interesting sort of highly dramatic, brooding plot, which just happens to be the type of story that I just eat up. There's so many beautiful lines in this book that I love that are actually quite dramatic if you think about them, and I'm not gonna lie, the romance is toxic, but I just loved every moment of it. And then I have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and this one is again a gothic romance. The book follows our main character Jane Eyre, and we follow her from when she's a child into her adulthood, and we follow her as she's this young orphan who's like bullied by her cousins that she's forced to live with, I think. And we watch her sort of grow up and become a governess, and then move into this house owned by this mysterious man named Mr. Rochester, because she's there to teach his ward, who is this young little girl who is a bit of a handful herself. And from from there, the book goes in some weird and interesting directions, and there is obviously a romance to it, but there's also this very creepy element of some secrets in the house and someone obviously out to get Jane Eyre. All right, on to the next category. We're going to talk about the dark academias that I highly recommend you pick up this fall. So obviously I have to talk about the OG of dark academias, and that is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. If you haven't read The Secret History yet, what are you doing? It is a fantastic book. It is a literary fiction. It's such a fucking long book, but it's such a great time. Donna Tartt's writing is just absolutely impeccable, and the way that these characters sort of come to life is just so insane. And the way that you get absolutely wrapped up in the psychological aspect of the book is just so fantastic. The book essentially follows a group of students who are in this classics program, and they have this very eccentric professor. And it talks about the sort of academia aspect of it and the class element that's going on, but it overall sort of comes to revolve around this horrible act that these group of students commit together, and the way that they get wrapped up in the darkness of this act and are forced to contend with the consequences. Like many dark academias, the book also has a fairly unreliable main character, which adds to the story overall. And if you're one of those people who's never tried a dark academia book, but you loved the movie Saltburn, you need to read this book. On a very similar note, I have If We Were Villains by ML Rio. I would say this book is like the most similar to The Secret History. This one involves a group of students who are in a Shakespearean acting academy, and the group of students in this book are just bogged down by the competitive nature of the program, but they also find themselves wrapped up in the psychology of the Shakespearean plays that they put on, especially Macbeth. This one also has an unreliable narrator and a really interesting cast of characters, to be honest. And I think one thing that I really enjoyed about this one was just the underlying subtext of tension and sexual tension between some of the characters. All right, and then I cannot recommend dark academia books without recommending Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is the dark academia novel that has taken over the world since it came out. And if you still don't know anything about Babel, it essentially is set in the 1800s, and it follows a group of 4 students who are attending Oxford. And they happen to be a part of the fictional translation institution at Oxford called Babel. And there's actually this tower called Babel for the Translation Institute at Oxford. All of this is fictional. And essentially in this version of history and our world, there is a level of power to translation, like a magical power, that is used by colonial forces to continuously oppress their colonies. And so the book not only examines academia, this group of students, the pressures, but it also has really strong elements of colonialism, politics, and how translation can be used as a tool of colonialism. This one also involves a terrible act that these students get themselves into, and the psychological impacts of that in the later half of the book. Okay, the next dark academia that I have is The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. This one is definitely more on the magical side. It is more of a fantasy that's set in our real world, but follows these 6 different main characters who are one day approached by this mysterious person named Atlas, who asks them to become part of the Atlas 6, who will compete to become one of the caretakers of this like mysterious library of Alexandria that's full of all of this magical knowledge. And each of these 6 people is from a different area in the world, and each of them has a different magical ability. A lot of the magic is sort of grounded in science, and the 6 main characters are sort of pit against each other, and the competitiveness and the academia aspect is really strong in this book, but it also has this element of the psychological impact on the characters, sort of making them crack and do some terrible things. This one is also the first of a series. It's got 2 more books in the series, which I'm planning to pick up sometime soon, but I really love this one. All right, next I have Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This one involves more magic and horror and supernatural elements. The book follows our main character, Alex Stern, who has a very dark past, but she gets a second chance at life when she is allowed to become a student at Yale and become part of the Ninth House of Yale, which is essentially a house or organization which essentially works to preserve the order of the different secret societies at Yale, who all perform these deadly magical rituals that add to their own power and to the power of the alumni who come out of their societies. And so the book obviously examines the privilege that goes on at Yale and sort of takes it through this magical supernatural lens. Next I have Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This is a book that's partly set in academia, and it follows these 2 main characters who are essentially like friends who turn into enemies. And in the main timeline, they're sort of working to destroy each other when Victor comes out of jail. But in the flashback timeline, you learn about their friendship when they were in university and how their competitiveness began and how they both got sucked into this study of extraordinaries, who are essentially these people who have like some sort of supernatural superhero ability. And the 2 of them sort of work to find a way to turn themselves into extraordinaries. This one is definitely a twisty, dark book and has a really interesting dynamic between the two main characters. It's essentially pent-up queer tension that manifests in some dark and crazy ways. Next I have Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. This one's definitely more on the gothic side, but it does have an element of academia because the main character goes off to this like mysterious academy where no one is able to contact the outside world, and they spend years there studying some very strange things and get pulled into some really creepy situations. This one definitely doesn't have like the group of students element that a lot of dark academias have, and so that's why I probably wouldn't say that it's like very much a dark academia. It could be like in between multiple categories, but it is definitely very spooky and very weird and perfect for spooky season. Okay, and then the last dark academia that I have is Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergei Dyachenko. This is actually a translated fiction and it is a bit of a dark academia. It is more on the like psychological side of things, and I'm actually in the middle of reading it, so I don't know how it ends, but I have heard really amazing things about it from other people, and so far it's been really creepy and strange and super intriguing. All right, on to the weird and spooky books that I have for you. These are all books that are set in our real world. Some of them are on the literary fiction side, and all of them have a very like strange and spooky element to them that I personally think is perfect for the fall. So first up I have The Goth House Experiment and Other Stories by S.J. Sindhu. This is a short story collection that covers a lot of different themes, but a few of the stories are more in that spooky gothic realm, and it's honestly just a group of like really weird stories that you would not expect and that are just so great. And then I have Natural Beauty by Ling Huang. This is one of my favorite horror books ever, and it's such a super weird book, but it essentially revolves around the idea of beauty and natural beauty and what people believe beauty to be. And it follows our main character, who is sort of this washed up piano prodigy, and she finds herself being offered this job at this like beauty company called Holistic, and she and the other employees are given these different beauty products to make them look very beautiful for the customers that are coming into the store. But as the main character will learn, there are some very dark and sinister things going on with this company, and she herself will go through some very interesting transformations. And then I have 3 books by the same author, who is just the queen of making like spooky, weird fall books that are just fantastic and definitely worth the read. So of course that author is Mona Awad. This is her first book, Bunny, which has a bit of an academic setting to it. It follows a main character who's in a writing master's program, I think, and she basically gets involved with this group of other women, and it turns into this really freaky and weird situation. The main character is an unreliable narrator, so that adds to the story, and it's honestly just a book that you need to experience. Like, I can't really explain what it is because it's just so strange. And then I have All's Well by Mona Awad. This one's a little bit easier to explain because it follows a drama professor who previously had a really vibrant acting career, but because of a freak accident, she is unable to act again, and she is left with this chronic pain that sort of runs her life. And so when she's approached by these strange figures who basically take away her pain, she finds herself becoming a very different person and spiraling in a way that could not be expected. And amidst this all, she's forcing her students to put on the play All's Well That Ends Well by Shakespeare. This is a really strange one that I honestly really loved and is probably my favorite among Mona Awad's books. All right, and then the last Mona Awad book that I have is Rouge, and this one is a little bit similar to Natural Beauty in the sense that it talks about the idea of beauty and just perfection and unrealistic expectations for beauty. But this one sort of revolves more around the main character's mommy issues when her mother dies, and she's forced to return to her mother's home and pack up her things, but she's approached by these strange people who are offering her a gateway into a beauty that she has always coveted. As I'm talking about these books, I feel like all of the categories are fairly fluid, so don't take them too seriously, but this next category is a bunch of books that are fantasies that are on the dark and spooky side, and some of them have more of a like magical realism element to them. So first up I have one of my favorite books ever, and that is The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina by Zoraida Cordova. This one definitely has a really great spooky vibe to it, and it follows this one family called the Montoyas, and they are all descended from this one woman, Orquídea Divina. She's had multiple husbands over her life, and so the family is really big, and all of them are sort of gathered together one day when she sends out these letters to them all saying that she is going to die and she wants to give them their inheritance. And so they all assemble for different reasons. You know, some of them are more ambitious and cutthroat than others. Some of them just want to know what's going on. And this meeting goes in a very interesting and strange way that has some lasting consequences. And the members of the family start to be visited by some strange dark force that is slowly trying to take the family down. Again, this has a magical magical realism element to it that plays into all of this, and there's very strange things that happen. But another aspect to the story is that we get perspective chapters from Orquídea herself from when she was younger, and we start to learn who she was and what brought her to become this powerful matriarch and why she has left this inheritance to her family. Really love this one. The vibes are just amazing, and it's just a beautifully told book as well, so highly recommend. On a similar vein of like magical realism and strangeness, I have The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshni Chokshi. Although this wasn't my favorite book, I do think it has like that really nice spooky fairy tale-esque vibe that's perfect for this time of year. And this one is a bit of a gothic tale as well, and it follows this man who has been married to this woman named Indigo. She's an heiress, and he finds himself learning some strange and dark secrets about his wife. And in between those chapters, we get long parts with this other character named Azure, who was childhood friends with Indigo. And we start to learn about this female friendship and the strange things about Indigo and about the place that she lived in, and some sinister things going on. And all of it is told as if it's a fairy tale, but think of a like grim fairy tale rather than one of those like happy-go-lucky Disney movie fairy tales. It's very dark, it's very creepy, and everything has horrible consequences. This one is definitely more vibes than plot, but it was still a fun read. And then next I have A Study in Drowning by Ava Reed. This one could be classified as a dark academia, but I feel like less of it is about the academia part and more of it is about sort of this fairy tale-ish idea. It's set in this fantasy world where our main character attends this architecture college, and the architecture college is known for not having women, or like they're not allowed or something like that, and she's like the only girl there. And this main character has gone through a lot. There's like rumors about her and one of the professors at the school, but it seems like something strange was going on, and I would look up content warnings for this one for sure. But our main character has always been obsessed with this book called Angharad, which is this book that was written by this reclusive man named Emrys Mirrodin, and the book is based off of this like fairy tale about the fairy king, and it's this epic love story between the fairy king and this woman named Angharad. Now our main character has always loved this book and she's been obsessed with it, and she's also been visited by visions of the fairy king, and she finds herself unable to let go of this obsession. And so when the family estate of Emrys Mirrodin, who has died long ago, asks the architecture college to find them someone who will redesign their estate, the main character ends up getting selected for this project, and she travels to the estate to go work on the project, and she ends up meeting this young man from the literature or like some other university who is doing some research on Emrys Mirrodin, and essentially the two of them start working together and start learning some very strange and dark things about this man and about the overall story of Angharad and the fairy king. Things get really dark and spooky and strange, and the main character's dealing with these visions and feels like she's going insane, and it's overall got that dark and spooky vibe, but it's more on that fairy tale-esque side, but again sort of this like grim fairy tale, like where there's lots of consequences and dark things going on. Next I have The Keeper of Night by Kylie Lee Baker. This is a mythological fantasy that is honestly very creepy and dark in my opinion, and essentially our main character is a biracial woman. She's British and Japanese, and she is half British Reaper and half Japanese Shinigami, and she has been among this hierarchy of Reapers, but she has always felt out of place because she is half Japanese, half Shinigami, and they like do not like each other, I think. And essentially when things blow up in her life with the Reapers, she flees to Japan to sort of reconnect with that side of her family and like find something, and she ends up getting like taken into the Shinigami world, into this sort of like fantasy, like mythological world with like different creatures and things, and starts to learn more about that side of herself, and it gets really dark and creepy. And although this book wasn't my favorite, it was still really like creepy and slightly shocking in the twists that come along the way. And I really liked seeing our main character sort of grapple with this like dual identity and trying to find her place in things. On a lighter note though, I have The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. This one is definitely a cozy little fantasy with witchy vibes. It's set in our present day real world-ish, and our main character is a witch, and she has been raised apart from other people. She didn't have a family growing up, and she's always been sort of told that she needs to keep her witchery a secret. But when she's sort of contacted by these people who want her to come teach these young witches, she finds herself sort of agreeing to the situation and ends up becoming friends and finding a family amongst these people and the place that they live in, and also finds herself falling in love with the grumpy librarian. I wouldn't say this one is like dark or spooky at all, but it does have like this cute witchy vibe, and it's got a bit of a mystery to it, which I think was done really well. And it's honestly just adorable and cute and a cozy vibe for the fall. On a similar witchy note, I have Venko by Sherry Dimeline. This one involves a main character who sort of gets adopted into this group of witches, and they are all sort of fighting against this age-old evil that is determined to wipe them out. The book at times feels like a fairy tale, but also like a magical realism story, but also has this really beautiful cast of female main characters who are all just sort of looking out for each other. And overall, I would say, although it's like slightly dark and spooky, it's definitely a more like cozy vibe, and I really loved seeing these characters come together. All right, and now we are on to the final category of books. I feel like I've been talking for ages, so we're gonna whip through these last ones. And I also left the thrillers to the end because honestly, I don't really read many thrillers usually. So these recommendations are just kind of the thrillers that I've read that I think are pretty good, but they are by no means like the best thrillers in the game because I have not read enough thrillers to know which ones are the best. But starting off with Alex Michaelids, I have The Silent Patient. This is a psychological thriller that gets super weird and intriguing and has a really great twist to it as well. I personally was just hooked on the story and could not stop reading. It was definitely a really fast read for me, and it essentially follows the perspective of this man who is a criminal psychotherapist, and he's always been captivated by the story of this woman named Alicia, who is this woman who one day came home from work, was totally fine, and then shot her husband 5 times in the face and murdered him. And since then, she has stopped speaking. She's never said a word since then, and she's been kept in a mental institution ever since. And so our main character, who is this criminal psychotherapist, is obsessed with her story, and he wants to try and work with her and see if he can coax some words out of her. Now, aside from his perspective, we also get perspective chapters from Alicia from before the murder, and we're starting to piece together what happened in the lead up to her murdering her husband. This book is really fun because both narrators are kind of unreliable, and you're seeing the story sort of come together across both perspectives in some really interesting ways. And honestly, I just thought it was a really fun, spooky, creepy time. And then I have another Alex Michaelids book, and that is The Maidens. This one is a bit of a like academia story as well because it's set at a college or university and involves these like young women who start going missing or get murdered, I think. But essentially it follows our main character, who is a group therapist, and her niece Zoe is going to this university and she is found like brutally murdered one day. And so Mariana goes to the university to try to figure out what happened, finds herself getting embroiled in the mystery of this one professor who has this group of female students who always gather together with him to have a study group, and they're called the Maidens amongst like everyone at the university. And so there's some strange things going on with him, with these women, and our main character is trying to figure out what's going on, and she's super convinced that this professor is the one to blame. This one was interesting because it also involves like Greek mythology, and like the whole idea of the maidens comes from like, I think Dionysus's maidens, something like that. And although I didn't love this one as much as The Silent Patient, it was still a really interesting read and really creepy as well, and has that like dark, you know, academia element, like not actually dark academia, but like academia that's like dark and just creepy overall. Okay, and then next I have one of my favorite thrillers ever, which is In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. This one is again set in a school context, and it follows our main character who is attending a reunion at her university many years after she went there. And it follows this group of friends that she had when she was in university, and back when they were in university, at the end, one of the people in the group ended up getting killed, and the police were unable to figure out who actually killed them. But the whole group and sort of university has this suspicion that it was this like one person in the group, and so they've been sort of ostracized, and the whole group as a whole has been like sort of divided. And so they're meeting again at this reunion, and they're basically like talking again and sort of going over what happened back then, and you're getting the story from the main character's perspective and what happened along the way, and we're starting to get to know these characters, but we also flip between the perspectives of the other characters as they tell their side of the story at this reunion, and by the end we start to figure out who the murderer actually was. This one was really fun because it's not only like the dark psychological thriller, it also has just like other smaller mysteries going on with each of the characters, and you start to figure out why they do the things they do. And some of it doesn't actually have to do with the murder itself, it was just shit that they were going through, which I found to be really interesting. Okay, and then next I have The Writing Retreat by Julia Bartz. This one's definitely more of a like winter vibe because it is set in the winter and there's a lot of snow, but I do feel like it's still like a cozy read that you could pick up for the fall. And essentially it follows our main character, who is a a writer and who has never had much success. She and her best friend were like really close before and both were obsessed with this like big author, but she and her friend have since had a falling out. And when the main character gets accepted into this like exclusive writing workshop with the author that they both loved, she jumps at the chance, but then she finds out that her friend also got accepted. And so the two of them are at this eccentric author's home in the middle of nowhere, and they become part of this workshop where they have to like write as much as they can during this time. But things start to escalate when the author herself starts to up the competitiveness between the women who are there for the workshop. So it's not just the girl and her friend, there's like other women there too. And it also just sort of like goes off the rails in like a really creepy thriller way. It definitely wasn't my favorite thriller, but I do think it was a very cozy one and like a creepy one and just fun for this time of the year. So I would recommend it for that reason. All right, and then the final book that I have for this category and for this entire video is Daisy Darker by Alice Feeney. This is another one that I didn't particularly love, but I do think it was a really addicting thriller. It's basically a closed door mystery in the sense that all the characters are on this island and they're unable to leave as multiple people in the group start dying and everyone's trying to figure out who the killer is. This one has a bit of a gothic vibe as well, and all the characters are part of the same family and they're assembled there on that island at their grandmother's home, the Nana's home, because it's her like 80th birthday or something like that. And there's this element of all of them looking out for their own interests because they all want something out of the inheritance. I feel like the island setting of this one with like the storm in the background definitely added a really spooky, creepy element to this. And this one also has like a really interesting twist that I think is fun for spooky season. Alrighty, with that, those are all the books that I wanted to recommend. I have a whole mess of books here that I'm gonna need to clean up, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you found something that you want to pick up for the fall. It's my favorite time of the year, so I hope that you find something cozy and creepy and spooky and fun to read this season. As always, let me know if you guys have read any of these books and what you thought of them, and if you would recommend any other spooky fall books for the people watching here. As always, if you haven't already, go check out my Instagram, Goodreads, TikTok, and Bindery community down below. As always, thank you so much to my Bindery members for supporting me and my channel and for making it possible to publish books with my publishing imprint, Boundless Press. If you're not yet a member of my Bindery community, definitely go check it out down below. For the price of a coffee, you can get extra exclusive content from me and also a full behind the scenes process with my publishing imprint, Boundless Press. There are already so many posts and videos that are on my Bindery feed already, so you'll get access to all of them immediately once you join. All right, that's all I have to say, so I'll see you guys next time, and please remember that this story ain't over. Bye.